stories don't define you. How you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and chief story maker of Elkins Consulting.
When we share stories, whether in our personal or business lives, how we share them makes a difference in how we remember them and in how we're perceived by the people we're sharing them with. When you're listening to this podcast, I encourage you to listen and consider your own related stories. To listen and think about which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. And think about how you share those stories and the messages they carry for you and for the people who are hearing them.
I meet people in the most unusual circumstances and very cool ways. And this today's guest on the Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will podcast is no exception to that. A few weeks ago, back in February, I had the opportunity to interview one of my friends that I've known since second grade. And both of us moved around a lot as kids. I went to 4 different elementary schools. She went to 5 or 6 different elementary schools. And yet we still kept in touch over all of these years. And we're both going to be 50 this year. Well, in the mix of that, I've met a handful of her friends over the years, like at her wedding in 1993 and at different things that I've seen her at in the last, 20 years. But I hadn't seen Amy, Amarissa Denzel, in, it had been at least 5 or 6 years when I got to interview her face to face from the living room of the Airbnb where we were staying in California. So after our conversation, her friend Annette Taylor, who had listened to that podcast episode, asked for an introduction. And she said, I just would love to hear more about what she's doing. And I would love to share what I've been thinking about over the years because I think it's relevant to her topics and themes. So of course, if Amy Denzel says, you need to meet my friend Annette Taylor, I of course say, yes, absolutely. There's something wonderful about being introduced to people through people that you love. I mean, it almost always works out for the best. So Annette Taylor, thank you for joining me today.
Of course.
So Annette lives in Ventura, California, and has a master's in child development. Is that correct?
Basically, yes. It's technically something else, but it's an emphasis in early childhood education.
Oh, okay. But then you have switched and now your primary income is from what?
Actually, my primary income is not something that's based on what I'm studying. It's kind of like a midlife crisis I'm having where I had an experience and I wanted to know more about why I had it. And then I started basically kind of working on my own doctorate, if you would need to label it. So, yeah.
Sure. Okay. And that's what you wanted to talk about during this podcast episode and kind of have a conversation about where that goes and how to apply it, all that stuff.
Right.
So, I always ask my podcast guests to share something about themselves that most people wouldn't know. And I do that so that our listeners get a chance to get to know you in a different context from how we're going to be talking throughout the rest of the interview. So do you have something to share?
I do. I was kind of, you prepped me a little, which was very nice. I was torn between 2 things I'd like to share. One is I play the drums. Well, I took lessons for 3 years and I can play the drums, which is fun. But the other thing I think is maybe a little more relevant is that I have a learning disability.
And you think most people don't know that about you?
Yeah, because I kind of just seem like I don't have a learning disability, but actually I do.
Well, I think that that's not as uncommon as we would like to think, that people don't know these things because we don't share that information. And if there's no assumption made, then why would you know that?
Right. And I didn't know until I was well into my 20s. So I'm sure there are people I'm sure there are a lot of people that probably have a glitch somewhere and it doesn't matter or it doesn't bother them. But I think you're right. I think it's more common than we know.
Wow. That's really interesting in your 20s.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think it well, we'll talk about that in a minute because I have all kinds of questions about that. But let's back up a little too. You played drums. So tell me a little bit about when you got started and are you still playing drums?
Well, I first started taking drum lessons in my late 20s. I had a friend who was an instructor, so I felt kind of comfortable as an older person to go ahead and try the drums. I got a decent tax refund randomly one year, and it was like a chunk of money, and I was like, ooh, fun. And then I bought a kit. I bought a set of pink pearl drums, and I started taking lessons, and it was super fun.
That's awesome. Do you still have those pink pearl drums?
I don't have the pink ones, but I do have a son who's now 14 who plays percussion in band at school. And a couple years ago, we cleaned out a closet and put up carpet padding and put a set of drums in there. So he and I, mostly me recently, but he and I kind of share that room. It's our drum room.
That little studio. So nobody else gets annoyed by it.
Yeah, it takes the edge off. It's not like it's perfectly quiet, but it's tolerable.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm going to have to really think about that because my son, my 21-year-old who just came home, because most kids are home right now because of the virus, he just picked up the banjo. So maybe take a closet and repurpose it.
It's so nice because you're like, if they're like hyper or angsty, you can just be like, go play. And it's not like a big commitment for you. It's something
that's a great idea. I'm going to have to do that. Last night, it was nice enough outside that he went outside to practice on the front porch so that it wouldn't bother us.
Nice.
My husband and I, well, we're both musicians. We play in a couple bands together. He plays guitar and I sing. And so our kids have had this music room. Our living room is all a music room. It has a PA set up with speakers and microphones, a full drum set, piano, keyboard, multiple guitars, a 3/4 stand-up bass. I mean, we have a total music room. So when nobody's home, our younger son, who is now home as well from college, goes and plays on the drums because he played drums in junior high. And my husband and I both, we love every kind of music, basically. But sometimes bluegrass just, I can only hear a few songs at a time and then it just all starts to sound the same to me. So I can't really listen to bluegrass very much. But stuff with banjo in it is, again, one song in a set of 20, I can listen to it, but that's about it. So when my son first said, oh, I want to play banjo, my husband and I both rolled our eyes like, oh no, we have a 3/4 stand-up bass. We have a viola in the basement. Could you take up something else?
That I have on hand? Come on.
Exactly. So he bought himself a banjo when my husband and I were out of town.
Oh, my word.
But the beauty of it is that it was because he heard a song that he found very ethereal and soothing and entrancing. And so he wanted to learn the banjo part of that song. And we happen to have a very good friend that lives just a couple blocks away from us that is now giving him Zoom banjo lessons.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome.
In trade for some work that Jacob's going to do for him. So it's a pretty nice, pretty cozy setup, but I have to tell you that whole closet with carpet on the inside sounds really appealing.
Yeah. We paid the carpet guy who was doing the carpet in our house, 60 extra bucks. And he just went in there and put up the stuff and it worked out great.
That's awesome. So back to our theme. I was curious after reading some of what you've been doing and looking at your LinkedIn profile. I got really curious because you went from this human development, which includes some biology, to a completely different field, which I can see the relationship, but I'd love to hear it from you. First of all, what you switched from and to, and then you told me you have a story, a pivot point about why you started really researching and digging into this concept.
Yes. So I got a master's in early childhood education, and I was a preschool teacher for a while. Then I had a back injury, and then I switched. I was on the campus of a local university, and I switched from the child care center, and they moved me over to the physics department. And I was kind of upset because I'd just gotten this master's in early childhood education, and here I was going to be working with physicists, but lo and behold, it wasn't that different. So it was my job to tell the physicists about the facility, and they were visiting from other universities or whatever, and it all worked out. It was fine. And then I went in a totally different direction. I worked with a friend in the IT department at a Fortune 500 company, so I think I was a little not lost, but I didn't feel like I could use my degree because of my back issue. I really wanted to work with young children. So I eventually got married, had my own kids, and then they got out of my range. Like I knew 0 to 8, kids that are little to kids till they turn 8. And not that I didn't know what to do with my kids, but I think I felt a little out of my wheelhouse a little bit. So, not that I didn't like back off or anything, but it just, I didn't really know what was going to happen next. So, you get through life, you get to know your kids, and everything works out fine. And then they got to be, I think they were like 9 and 12.
Oh.
And I don't know. I kind of blame my dog. We were talking about our dogs earlier. We got a puppy, and they were at school, and I was at home, and I was training this puppy, and I was kind of stuck. When you have a puppy, you kind of have to be with it all the time if you want to potty train it or do whatever. And so I was watching TV a lot, and happened upon the show and got really into it and had kind of a fan experience that I'd never had, even as a teenager. And it was very not troubling, but like, what is this about?
Puzzling.
Yeah, it was puzzling because I'm like, I feel like the same person I was when I was 13. But I even went to a fan convention for this show.
Oh, wow. Okay. What was the show?
It's called Supernatural.
Oh, yeah. My younger son loves that show.
Does he really? Oh my God, that makes me happy. Yeah. So it's on a network that's kind of for young people. So it was like doubly puzzling that I would be interested in the show. And went to a fan convention. I met a couple of the actors. And I tried to treat it like I do other things, like academically, because that's where I'm comfortable. And despite the fact I have a learning disability, I feel comfortable learning stuff. So I interviewed a friend who was a huge fan of Pearl Jam, and asked her, what's it like? She would go to concerts all across the country multiple times a year, and she had these friends that were her Pearl Jam friends, and I was fascinating in it. And I interviewed her before I went to my convention. I tried to treat it like, I think I tried to distance myself from it a little bit and like treat it like, oh, this is an experiment. And yeah, I'm forging ahead and I'm going to find out about these conventions and blah, blah, blah. But anyway, luckily I have a cousin who I didn't know very well until this like common experience that we had. And she lived on the East Coast, and the only convention we could go to was in New Jersey. And she was in Maryland, and I'm here in California. And we were like, what is wrong with us? Like, we are dropping not only time, but money to go to this convention. And we were like, what are we doing? So I tried to treat it kind of clinically, and we went and we had a really good time. And I met one of the actors who was like so gracious, and it was a brief encounter, but it really affected me. And I had a like major meltdown on the flight home, like major. And that's what kind of sent me on this, I guess, deep dive into like, why did that happen? And how did it happen? And how did it happen to me? And I just came to find out eventually that it should happen to everyone.
Okay, so what is it exactly that you're studying?
It's basically evolutionary psychology, which didn't exactly exist when I got my BA, my first, college degree. But I did come to find out that the founders of evolutionary psychology were at UCSB when I was there.
Oh.
But they hadn't put it all together yet. So when I, 30 years later, came back around and was like, I remember someone talking about evolutionary psychology and thinking it might fit with what was happening or had happened to me. I was surprised to find that the Center for Evolutionary Psychology is at my alma mater, which is not very far from where I live. So
what part of that field of study relates to your sudden fandom? You're falling into that category of fandom.
Yes, I think basically what evolutionary psychology studies is, the way I like to describe it is, in the history of humans, we've evolved, obviously, and then we have our tree dwelling time, and then we have our cave dwelling time, and then we have our house dwelling time. And our house dwelling time has only happened for the last 12,000 years. The tree dwelling time is millions of years ago. But what evolutionary psychology mostly studies is that cave dwelling chunk of time, which is also millions of years, but it's when we started trusting each other and working together as cohesive groups. And I started seeing a lot of common threads with fandoms and this kind of
tribal.
Tribal and urge for common connection.
Community, yeah.
Yeah, but having one of the founders of evolutionary psychology, I kind of know them now because I keep going to their symposiums. They're probably like, who is this person that has no relation to any university currently, except I'm having this, I'm compelled to like learn more about this. Mm-hmm. He calls it co-registration. It's the experience of experiencing, a group of people experiencing something at the same time and reacting to it. He calls it co-registration. And I think that is something that's missing with not only like people in general, because it's so easy to go off in your own little world. If you're online, you can pick and choose what you want to learn about or listen to, or but specifically with fandoms, I talk a little bit in my blog about how fans used to have like a choice of 3 channels, and almost everyone you knew watched a certain show or had heard of a certain show, and it was this common place where you could relate to each other. And I think we've lost that with all the streaming and stuff like that. So the fact that this show that I was watching, not only did it, attract a lot of different kind of fans, it's been on for 15 years. So it actually bridges it was on during a time when there weren't that many channels. And now the show is ending. And a lot of the fans, I think, it makes sense. They're kind of freaking out that the show is ending, and I'm kind of caught up.
Grief.
Yeah,
it's real grief. It's loss.
And it's not just. For me, it's not just the fans are losing a show and a common point. It's that time in our history, as far as entertainment goes, is also going to end. I think the only other show that's been on that long, American show that's been on that long, is Grey's Anatomy. But they've had a lot of changes in actors. So anyway, I'm a big fan.
It's really, all of this is so connected to what I've been reading about and understanding over the last 6 to 8 months after I had an interview, episode 86 with Mark Bowden, about the importance of being inauthentic in terms of personal growth. And then I had this great conversation with Rajkumari Niyogi, who is studying epigenetics and the impact of trauma genetically on us and on our children and grandchildren. And so it's genetic or generational PTSD is kind of where that study is going. And now I just had a conversation last month with Monica Borgo, who is an author of The Change Code, writing about spiral dynamics and self-actualization and those waves of people moving from one part of this self-actualized community understanding of their role in a community and shifting into another phase of that. And then just this week's podcast episode was, again, I re-interviewed Mark Bowden to bring all that stuff together and talk about how we can address the polarization in our communities as a result of understanding more about all these particulars in how our environments shape us. And now I'm thinking the scientists that are studying evolutionary psychology are really going to have a heyday of research material over the virus and all of us experiencing this together, but in very different ways. So I'm thinking about how people absorb the show Supernatural, whether they're sitting by themselves in a dark basement apartment, or whether they're sitting with their families or their partner or with the dog. How they experience the show is different, but the end result is that connection. No matter where they watched it, they have a connection with other people that watched it and felt that same connection to it.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I went to a theme park fairly recently and I was wearing my Supernatural t-shirt and this perfect stranger just walked right up to me and was like, "Did you see last week's episode?" And it was like, we were like, I don't even know who she was, what her name was, anything about her, and didn't even matter. And it was pretty cool.
That is cool. And I think it speaks to the fact that we are all looking for connection in some way, and that we're kind of on this next wave of internet and digital activity of going from kind of choosing to self-isolate, and then being forced to self-isolate. And that shift, I think, is really going to be interesting for researchers over the next 10 and 20 years to see how people wanted more authentic connection. And they were already starting on that path because they were seeing the disconnect in society as a result of so much time spent digitally connecting, that now we're kind of forced to find other ways to connect. And the digital connections aren't cutting it right now for so many people.
Oh my gosh.
And they were.
Oh yeah, I totally agree.
But they thought they were. Like, I had this interesting conversation with what ended up being one of my coaching clients for communication coaching. She has severe social anxiety, and she was telling me that she was getting all of what she needed socially from her online interactions. And I said, I just don't think that's true. I said, you can say that and you can try to convince yourself, but I just don't think that's true, because we as human beings are designed to taste, touch, smell. We are designed for face-to-face interaction. That's our human nature. So maybe you think it's enough for you, but at some point you're going to realize it's not, and you're going to have to find a way to connect with others in person, face-to-face. And she kept arguing with me online, went back and forth on a LinkedIn post for probably 5 or 6 comments. And finally I said, give me a call. I would love to actually talk to you about this and take this offline. Wow. So she called me and she, told me why she has this social anxiety and where it came from. And I said, okay. And I said, but what are you doing that's really satisfying you? What do you feel that you find really satisfying? And she broke down crying. She said, I'm just so lonely.
It's tough.
And so people are convincing themselves that those digital relationships are enough. But now with all that's going on in our world, I think people are starting to realize that it's not.
Right. I totally agree. And I actually wrote a little thing for my friends on Facebook that was like, this is my take on why you might feel anxious. Like week 1, things are okay. Week 2, starting to get a little tense or whatever. But I wrote like the top 10 things that might come up, and it was taken from what I call my inner cave dweller. Her name is Cave Girl Claire. And I write stories from her perspective. And I wrote like a survival guide for my friends. Like, this is what's probably really happening. And, do a puzzle instead of playing a competitive game, because we used to do things together, like, little simple things like that. So people
drawing together, playing hangman.
Doing something where you're making something together instead of competing. It will help a little.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So when you first started to study this, what was the first aha? What was the first article or book or podcast or whatever that you went, oh, that's okay. That's what this is. What was that experience?
For me, it was really gradual because my job was being a mom, and that's pretty consuming. So it was like I'd do research, I wouldn't. I'd do research, I wouldn't. I think I started by blaming media, like for my kind of fall down this rabbit hole, so to speak. And I think that kind of saying that, when I was younger and I was a fan of something, it was like, oh, that thing over there. And then when I became a fan of something in this day, in the information age, basically, it was easy to just get lost. And so I kind of started out by saying, oh, it's media's fault. I have all this access. And then I was like, well, wait a minute. Isn't it about self-control at some point? Like, should I blame media for my clicking a button, which is super easy? Like, if you talk about cave dweller habits, I mean, they did things, they used the least amount of energy possible to get things done because they didn't know when they were going to eat yet again, right? So clicking a button, like if I'm on YouTube, super easy. So right. Of course you fall down the rabbit hole. And the challenge was not to fall down the rabbit hole. And so how do you do that? And that kind of turned it a little bit and like put a little bit of the responsibility on me, I guess. And I can't say there was an aha moment, but that was like a turn where I was like, it's not media. Like, I have the power to not push the button.
Yes, you do. I'm guessing. So I don't necessarily believe on a light switch moment, like all of a sudden it's full bright. I do believe in dimmer switches. And I've said that before on this podcast, that things are almost always gradual. People that have a divorce situation where the wife comes home and says, I'm done. And the husband says, I had no idea this was coming. Like, okay, because that there were cues and clues, but they put it forward as if they didn't know, that they had absolutely no clue. But I just don't believe in that. I always believe that there are indications that we miss, that we're either in denial or we're just so self-absorbed that we miss those indicators.
Right.
But there is always a moment or a series of moments that make us realize that something has shifted. Mm-hmm. And we don't usually know it at the time of the moment. Mm-hmm. It's usually weeks or months or years later that we look back and go, oh, that was a big pivot point. I didn't realize at the time, but now that I look back, it was. So my guess is that you could look back at a specific conversation you had with somebody, or an article you read that brought it together and kind of put it in your face and made you want to dig deeper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess the thing that I read that did that for me is not I'd already been digging pretty deep. I mean, I was starting with nothing. I mean, I'm a mom. I knew how to do research, but it was probably about a year in, my sister recommended I read this book called Fame by Justine Bateman.
Mm-hmm.
And it gave the perspective of the famous person. And it also ultimately, months after reading this book, I realized what the real reason that I had this major meltdown on my flight home was because of the way that I had thought about this famous person that I'd met before I met him, which was really a lot of what Justine Bateman talked about in her book, which was, you're a famous person. It's like she described, she was in Family Ties. It was one of those shows from the 80s that everyone watched at the same time. It was one of those things, it was a touchstone. Like did you see Family Ties? Of course you saw Family Ties. She was the daughter in that show. And she had the experience of being white hot famous and then getting dropped like a rock, which happens to some people who are famous. And her description of being a famous person and feeling like someone sprayed her with paint and she couldn't get it off. And like everywhere she'd go, she would have these, people would make assumptions about her because she was famous, or they felt like they owned her because she was famous and she should perform for them all the time. And she actually went along with it because at the time she was probably in her early 20s. So you kind of, want to do it.
Right.
Fill a
make
role.
People happy,
whatever.
Make people
exactly.
Yeah.
And that made me see what it must have been like for this famous person that I met at this convention and how hard it must be to be famous. And I think I felt guilty because I had thought of him very callously and like an object, not like a person. And then when I met him and he was so kind, I was like taken aback, and it hit me on the plane, but I didn't know what it was.
Right.
I thought I was just having what my Pearl Jam friend called re-entry, where she's like, it's hard to go from this, fun, carefree place where everyone is thinking the same things and having a good time to going home. And I was like, oh, this re-entry really sucks. But then I read this book and realized, it wasn't, it was guilt. I really was not thinking of him as a whole person, and it was pretty callous. And it took probably a year for me to figure that out.
Did you ever write him a letter?
No, I feel like part of why I'm doing this deep dive into research is partially motivated because I want other people to know that you have these habits, and you have these habits of chunking or compartmentalizing just to get through life. I mean, our brains are not set up for this much information, and we have it, and the things that we do to get by can be hurtful to other people. In group, out group, stereotyping. I think all these things are basically coping mechanisms because our brains are basically only used to hanging out with 100 people at a time for long periods of time.
We have shorthand for people, and it categorizes them. Yeah. So as handy as it can be to categorize people like that, I really believe that the majority of people, when they meet somebody face to face, don't necessarily rely on those categories once they're talking to them, no matter what they look like or what they're wearing or whatever. I think we're drawn to a whole person when we are face to face with them. So we may have categorized all Jewish people in some way, or all women in some way, or all mothers, at-home mothers in some way. But when we meet one face to face, I think that those categories get blurred. I think the most important application of this is to recognize when those categories are blurred and apply it outside of that person and that interaction. To know that maybe your categories are a little skewed, or your generalizations about those categories might be wrong.
Yes, I wish it was easier to carry that, but I think we're just in a semi state of panic all the time. And we just rely on those categories more than I think that we realize. And it bums me out, but I'm really hopeful that all this, safe sheltering will maybe restart us at some level and allow us to go outside and meet our neighbors or something. I mean, I only know like a third of the people that live around me, and I'd like to know all of them, but we're always in a rush, and I'm hoping this slows us down a little. I don't know.
I hope so too. Of course, I have major concerns for children who aren't getting enough food or don't have internet access, so they're not getting the schooling they need. I am really concerned about the digital divide right now, particularly in rural areas. And of course, I live in Montana, so we have a lot of rural areas here, and kids and people, we already have the highest suicide rate in the country here in Montana. So I am concerned for that. And I'm hopeful in the way that you're hopeful that this whole thing reminds us how important our community is, every member of the community, from the most vulnerable to the people who are pretty well set.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah,
so,
isolation is definitely heavy.
Yeah. So where do you think you'll go with this? Do you want to write a book? Do you want to find a way to become a coach that would help people understand these concepts? I mean, have you had a moment where you went, oh, I should do this with all this information?
I kind of want to be like Ann Landers or Dear Abby. Like, I would love to be the expert, like have my inner cave girl answer questions or something like that. I think that would be fun, just to like give kind of a fun perspective, because it's kind of evolutionary psychology is not especially popular, and I think part of that is because it's new. I mean, it's only been around for 30 years or so, and I think a lot of evolutionary psychologists are trying to prove themselves and do all this research, and there's just so many graphs a person can look at and not get anything from the graphs. So I would really like to kind of come at it from another angle, like make it fun and relatable, and I don't know. We'll see.
Have you looked at anthropology as a complementary study to that? Because isn't that very similar in some aspects?
It is. Anthropology, though, is a little culture heavy. It mostly studies cultures. There are things that are they're in between. There's like sociobiology, and there's I kind of like archaeology better because it's a little more biology based.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of lean toward archaeology more than anthropology, and I'm for sure not an archaeologist, but I did talk to a friend who has a doctorate in archaeology, and he explained to me a little bit about that whole how it's done in America, and I don't know. Yes.
Well, it's just so interrelated with so many other things. I look at epigenetics as part of that, which is a relatively new study as well, because it's really about how our environment shapes our genetics, which you would think that if you're born with a certain set of genetics, a certain set of genes in a certain order, that's it, but that is not it. Right. Your environment plays a huge role, as does the environment of your maternal upbringing and her parents. And so there's so much connection here with so many other areas of study. And I think the best thing we can do as people who study these other areas, my friend is a neuroscience person, and she has her doctorate in education, Melissa Hughes, but she's been studying neuroscience in the context of education for years and has written a couple books on it. So a similar idea from what you're going through, but she's applied it in a different way. Mm-hmm. But even that has all kinds of connections with what you're talking about, that need for community, the need for gratitude, the need for human interaction, and to have something mutual, either an experience or a love for something, or even a hatred for something. And I think the challenge for us now as people who have all these interests and have access to all that information is finding ways to apply it to help people get along better, to help people address those big, scary problems, the complex issues that we're all facing right now in our global communities.
I think the main first problem is something that I'm kind of trying to tackle, is that we have instincts, but we have what's called instinct blindness, which is another term that the founders of evolutionary psychology came up with. And I think it kind of captures perfectly what I'm trying to like push back against, is that yes, we're humans, but we're also biological beings, and we come from a place where instincts used to keep us alive. And if you can acknowledge that, sometimes it's easier to step back and look at a way you've reacted to something and go, whoa, okay, that was fear, or that was something that happened because I didn't have control, but now I'm going to go back and be like, okay, that happened, sorry, or whatever. And that's kind of what I'm battling, instinct blindness is, but in a fun way.
I like that. And I think that's a great place to wrap this up, because I think that we've given our listeners a lot to consider. And I would love to encourage our listeners to reach out to Annette. She's on LinkedIn, and where is your blog? Can you share that?
Yeah, it is Blogspot. It's called Con Girl versus Cave Girl. Con girl meaning convention goer, right? That's the modern. Okay. The modern me is con girl versus cave girl. So that's the name of my blog.
And I will have a link to that in the blog post associated with this podcast, as well as a link to Annette's LinkedIn profile, so you can connect with her. I'm fascinated by all of these connections in the StrengthsFinder language. That would be connectedness and strategic. And they're all over the place in my head right now. So it's going to take a few weats, I think, to try to map this out.
I was screaming at your blog with, at your podcast with Monica. I was like, polarization, all these things where you guys were talking about. I was just like, so good.
Well, you're going to love that book then, The Change Code. Excellent. Annette, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. That was so fun.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will. If you're planning an event or company retreat and want to bring in a memorable, entertaining, and highly practical speaker as your keynote speaker or workshop facilitator, please visit us at elkinsconsulting.com to learn how we can help and provide a memorable keynote or breakout session. Thank you. I look forward to hearing from you.
Listen to me, honey, while I say, how could you tell me that you're going away?